She told me this desk wasn't meant for desire, but the way her eyes lingered on mine said otherwise. The first time I realized my boss was more than just the title she carried, it wasn't during some dramatic moment. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, in the quiet hum of the office. The kind of day where the clock ticks too slowly, the fluorescent lights feel too bright, and every keyboard clack blends into the same dull rhythm. I had been wrestling with a report for hours, lines of numbers blurring in front of me, when she appeared at my desk. She didn't knock or announce herself, she never had to. People always straightened their backs when she walked into the room, as if her presence carried its own gravity. 42, confident, self-assured, she had this polished grace that made everyone listen. But that day, when she leaned over my desk to glance at the report, I caught a glimpse of something else. Her perfume arrived before her voice, soft, steady, just a hint of something floral but grounded. Her hair fell forward as she scanned the page, brushing against her cheek. For a second, her lips curled at the corner in the faintest smile, like she was amused but didn't want me to notice. That smile, small, unguarded, felt more intimate than anything she could have said. I pretended to focus on the report, but my eyes betrayed me. They kept slipping to her hands as she gestured across the desk, pointing out corrections with neat precision. Her nails were short, practical, but her fingers moved with a kind of elegance that made the simplest motion feel deliberate. When the back of her hand brushed against mine, it wasn't even intentional, yet I felt it in the pit of my stomach. She didn't pull away, not right away. And maybe she didn't notice, or maybe she did and chose not to acknowledge it. That was the first moment I wondered if she ever let the armor slip, not in board meetings or during sharp negotiations, but here, in the quiet lull of the office when no one else was looking. I wanted to say something, to break the silence, but the words stuck in my throat. All I could do was listen to the steady sound of her voice, low and calm, guiding me through the errors like it was the simplest thing in the world. When she finally straightened, she adjusted the cuff of her blazer, looked at me with that unreadable gaze of hers, and simply said, "You'll get it right next time." It wasn't praise. It wasn't even criticism. But the way her tone softened at the end made it feel like more than a comment on my work. It felt like an invitation, to pay attention, not just to the report, but to her. The office feels different when it empties out. During the day, it's all chatter, ringing phones, and the constant thrum of activity. But at night, when most people have gone home, the silence wraps around everything like a blanket. The fluorescent lights seem harsher against the empty rows of desks, and even the smallest sounds, the scrape of a chair, the tapping of a pen, echo like secrets. That evening, she asked me to stay late. "We need to polish this proposal," she said, her tone crisp but not unkind. I nodded, trying not to show the flicker of nervousness in my chest. Working beside her without the buffer of a bustling office felt intimate in a way I couldn't put into words. Hours passed quietly. I typed, she edited, and the only interruptions were the occasional rustle of papers or the faint hum of the printer. At one point, I realized I was gripping my pen so tightly it left marks on my fingers. Maybe it was the silence, maybe it was her presence, it was hard to tell. Then, without a word, she appeared at my side holding 2 steaming mugs. "Coffee," she murmured, setting one on my desk. As I reached for it, her fingers brushed against mine. It was nothing, really. A small slip. But in the silence of the office, it felt like everything. My skin burned where her hand had touched me, and I glanced up to find her watching. Not staring, just a fleeting glance, curious, unreadable. I cleared my throat, desperate to mask the heat rising to my face. "Thank you," I said, lifting the cup. She smiled, a little crooked this time, before letting her eyes sweep across the chaos of my desk. "You work like a storm," she teased, her voice lighter than usual. I laughed nervously, running a hand through my hair. "A storm gets things done," I countered. Her laugh slipped out, soft, surprising. It wasn't the polished, professional laugh she used in meetings. This was quieter, unguarded, like she'd forgotten who she was supposed to be. And for that moment, I felt like I wasn't just her employee. I was someone she could share a secret with. The overhead lights flickered, humming faintly, but the glow of the desk lamp softened the space around us. It almost felt like we were no longer in an office, but in some private corner of the world where no one else could intrude. When she leaned over my chair to point at a figure in the report, her shoulder brushed mine. I didn't move. Neither did she. The silence stretched, fragile but full. That's when I realized, staying late had nothing to do with the proposal anymore. It had everything to do with the quiet gravity pulling us closer, one small gesture at a time. By the third late night in a row, the office had become almost unrecognizable to me. It wasn't just a place of deadlines and numbers anymore, it had turned into a kind of stage where every movement, every glance between us, carried more weight than the work itself. The world outside blurred away, leaving just her and me in the glow of the desk lamp. She was standing close, too close, leaning against my desk as she explained a correction. Her blazer hung open, revealing the faint curve of her blouse beneath, and the scent of her perfume was stronger in the still air. I should have been paying attention to her words, but all I could focus on was the nearness of her, the way her presence seemed to fill every inch of space around me. I shifted slightly in my chair, more to steady myself than anything else. She noticed. Of course she noticed, she always noticed. That was her gift, and her curse. Her lips curved in a knowing smile, subtle but undeniable. She tapped the edge of the desk with one elegant finger, then looked me directly in the eye. Her voice was low, deliberate. This desk isn't for that. For a second, I froze. My chest tightened, and I wasn't sure if she was teasing me, warning me, or daring me. The words could have ended everything if I let them. But something inside me, the part that had been holding back for too long, refused to retreat. I leaned forward, my voice softer than I expected, steady but carrying a pulse I couldn't hide. Then show me where. The silence that followed stretched impossibly long. She blinked, startled, but there was no anger in her eyes. Just surprise. And beneath it, something warmer. Something she wasn't ready to name. Her gaze lingered on me, unflinching, as if weighing the risk of breaking every rule she had built her career on. For the first time, I saw her slip, just for a heartbeat. Her composure cracked, and in its place was curiosity. She straightened, brushing invisible dust from her sleeve. "You're bold," she murmured, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't dismissal either. The air around us changed after that. Heavier. Charged. Like lightning waiting to strike. Every glance she gave me carried an unspoken question. Every movement I made felt like an answer I wasn't supposed to give. And yet, I knew we had already crossed a line that could never be erased. The night the proposal was finally finished, she offered to walk out together. It was late enough that the building felt abandoned, the hallways lined with shadows and the faint hum of the air conditioning. We didn't speak much as we packed our things, but there was an unspoken agreement lingering in the air. Something had shifted since the words I'd dared to say at the desk. When the elevator doors slid open, we stepped inside. The silence in that small, mirrored box felt heavier than any boardroom meeting I'd ever sat through. She stood on the opposite side, arms crossed loosely over her chest, her reflection split and multiplied on all sides. I watched her in the glass rather than directly, trying not to give myself away. Halfway down, she broke the silence. Her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it, stripped of authority. "People expect me to be untouchable," she said. Her eyes stayed on the floor numbers glowing above the door. "If I make one wrong move, I'm judged twice as harshly. There's no room for mistakes." I turned toward her, surprised, not by the words, but by the way her voice caught on that last sentence. She wasn't my boss in that moment. She was just a woman carrying the weight of expectations that never seemed to let her breathe. "You're not a mistake," I found myself saying, the words slipping out before I could stop them. My chest tightened as I wondered if I'd gone too far. Her eyes lifted to mine, sharp at first, then softening. She looked younger somehow, like the steel she always carried had melted just for a moment. "You don't know what that kind of pressure feels like," she whispered. "Maybe not," I admitted, holding her gaze. "But I know what it feels like to see someone hiding behind it." The elevator continued its descent, each second stretching longer than it should. She didn't reply, but she didn't look away either. And in that silence, something passed between us, something fragile, but real. I wanted to reach for her hand, to close that final distance. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I let the steadiness in my voice carry the truth she seemed too afraid to believe. "Everyone deserves to feel seen." Her lips parted slightly, like she might say something back, but the elevator chimed before she could. The doors opened, spilling in the cool night air from the lobby. She stepped out first, her shoulders squared again, her mask carefully in place. But as I followed, I caught her reflection in the glass, eyes softer, lingering. And I knew, she had heard me. The night after our big presentation, the office should have been empty. Everyone else had gone home hours earlier, riding on the high of success. But I found myself in her office again, drawn by something I couldn't name. She had left her door slightly open, warm light spilling into the hallway, and I paused there for a second before stepping in. She was different that night. The blazer was gone, her heels kicked off in the corner. She sat behind her desk with a glass of wine in hand, her posture relaxed in a way I'd never seen before. For once, she wasn't the commanding boss who had the whole company in her grip. She was simply, her. She glanced up when she saw me. A faint smile tugged at her lips. "Celebrating?" she asked, holding up the glass as if to toast me. "Trying to," I admitted, stepping inside. My voice felt too loud in the stillness, so I closed the door behind me. We talked for a while, light at first, about the clients, the long nights, the relief of pulling it all together. But the longer we sat there, the more the conversation drifted. She laughed more freely, not the polished laugh I was used to hearing in boardrooms, but something softer, deeper. I found myself leaning forward, elbows on my knees, watching her as though I'd never really seen her until now. And then it slipped out. "I admire you," I said quietly. My throat tightened, but I didn't look away. "Not just the way you work, or the way you lead. I admire you." The words hung in the air, raw and unpolished. Her laughter faded. Her lips parted as though she might respond, but nothing came out. Instead, she turned her face slightly, staring at the glass of wine in her hand. The silence was unbearable. I shifted closer, and without thinking, let my hand brush against hers where it rested on the desk. Just a light touch, enough to send a spark racing up my arm. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Her fingers twitched, almost closing around mine. But then, she pulled back. Slowly, gently, but deliberately. Her eyes lifted to mine, and in them I saw everything she wasn't saying. The conflict. The longing. The fear. "I can't," she whispered, barely audible. And yet, her voice trembled in a way that told me it wasn't rejection. It was restraint. I sat back, my chest aching, knowing we were caught in a dangerous balance, so close to everything, yet holding back at the very edge. The city lights flickered beyond the glass wall behind her, painting her silhouette in gold and shadow. And I realized, this was no longer just a slow burn. It was a fire, carefully hidden, waiting for the moment it could finally be free. For a few days after that night in her office, we barely spoke. Not because of anger or distance, but because every glance carried too much weight, every word risked spilling into something we weren't ready to say aloud. It was safer to bury ourselves in work, to pretend the fire smoldering quietly between us wasn't there. But on Friday evening, as the office emptied out, she appeared at my desk. No blazer, no files in her hand, just her. She lingered at the doorway before speaking, her tone softer than usual. Walk with me. I nodded before I even thought about it. The city outside was alive with its usual chaos, cars rushing, voices echoing, street lamps flickering against the evening sky, but beside her, the noise faded into something distant. We walked in silence at first, our steps falling into an easy rhythm. Her hands were tucked into the pockets of her coat, but her shoulders weren't as stiff as they usually were. She seemed lighter, though her eyes still carried that quiet storm. After a few blocks, she slowed and finally spoke. "You unsettle me," she said simply. Not harsh, not cold, just honest. I stopped, turning to face her. "Why?" Her lips curved in a faint smile, but her eyes told the real story. "Because you make me feel things I thought I'd closed off. I've spent years convincing myself that control was everything. That walls were safer. And then you came along, bold, relentless, not afraid to see past all of it." She shook her head lightly, as though she couldn't quite believe her own words. "You make me feel alive again. And that terrifies me." The honesty in her voice cut straight through me. I didn't rush to answer. Instead, I stepped closer, letting the space between us shrink until I could see the reflection of the streetlights in her eyes. Slowly, deliberately, I reached for her hand. For a moment, she hesitated. Her fingers twitched, her breath caught. And then, with a quiet exhale, she let her hand slip into mine. Warm. Steady. Real. Neither of us spoke right away. We didn't need to. The simple act of walking side by side, our hands intertwined, was louder than any confession. She squeezed my hand gently, her voice a whisper meant only for me. "Maybe it's not about the desk after all." I smiled, unable to stop the rush of warmth flooding my chest. "No," I said softly. "It never was." And just like that, the walls she had built so carefully didn't matter anymore. Out there, under the glow of the street lamps, she wasn't my boss, and I wasn't her employee. We were just two people, finally allowing ourselves to fall into something that had been waiting for us all along.